Hello everyone, this is While I am here. In today's video, we're going to go through the entire menu settings for your X-A7. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So right here on the side, you click this and this will bring you into the menu settings. And we're just going to go straight on down through all of these. And I'll explain some of the things that are important, but I am going to skip some things because they're just a little bit too in depth and there's things that you just don't want to change. So the first one we're going to cover is image size. Standard default is the 16:9, which is kind of the resolutions of most monitors nowadays, so I do recommend staying with that. If you do want to have the maximum resolution, then you can go by 3:2, but most likely what you're going to do when you output to a JPEG is you're going to have to crop a little bit because most people will do like 1080p or 4K, and that is a 16:9 ratio. So I'm just going to go ahead and stick with the default. Image quality, if you just want JPEGs, then I recommend going with fine. But for a person like myself, I always want the raw files. So I always do fine plus raw. That's my recommended settings. Film simulations, this is basically your color profiles. The standard one is actually very good. For myself, I usually like Velvia or Astia. Velvia if I'm doing landscapes or any type of non-portraits, and Astia if I'm taking pictures of people. Those are the two that I like the most, but this is definitely personal preference, so definitely go through all of these and just select the one you want. I'm just going to go ahead and select Velvia for this demonstration. And when we go down to dynamic range, I definitely recommend going with auto. The reason why I say auto is because most of these cameras are really good at analyzing how much light is coming in, and it's usually going to make a better decision than you are because you're going to forget to change this every single time you use it. So I always recommend auto. For white balance, I like to go with auto again because I'm already shooting raw and I can easily change my white balance in post. But if you're actually the type of person who wants to set their white balance, then you can either set this to a custom button or you can select the one you want right here. But it is a little bit of a pain to always have to come back in here and change your white balance. So I do recommend going with auto. For highlight tones, shadow tones, color, and sharpness, I always recommend going with 0 when you first start off. Once you start getting a feel for what the type of pictures or video that you're getting, you can definitely go back in here and kind of tweak it to how you like. But at the very beginning, I definitely recommend just going with the default. Same with noise reduction, long exposure on, and then the color space. sRGB is fine. You can kind of tweak that if you really want to later on. So we're going to go ahead and go into the focus settings. The focus area, we've already done that. If you actually hit this here, that's the screen with all of the dots. And I already covered this in my getting started video. So let's go ahead and go back into the menu screen. The next one down is the focus mode. So we are in single. You can also change to continuous or you can go to manual mode. A lot of times in my photography, I always choose AF single, but if you're tracking something, then obviously you want to go to continuous autofocus, and occasionally it might be useful for you to go to manual focus, but AF single is usually my recommended settings here. Autofocus modes, you can either choose single or zone. So you've already seen single, so that's the single square right here that you can move around. And then if you half press down, you get focus. Now, if you go to my other recommended one, which is zone, when you go to this, what you'll see is a bigger box. And if you come in here, let me move this. Sometimes it doesn't work. What you'll notice is that you'll see multiple boxes, and this is what's telling you what's in focus in that box. What I would recommend you use this for is for continuous focus. So if you were to go back in here and we were to go to continuous focus, now what we can do is hold down, and as I move around, you'll notice that the boxes change. So it's actually very useful for continuous focus, but for anything for single focus, I wouldn't use this box because it just tends to get a little bit annoying. So I'm going to go back in here. I'm going to lock off my tripod again. I'm going to go ahead and go back to single, and then I'm going to go from zone back to single focus because it's just a little bit more easier. The number of focus points, I personally like the lower number because I don't really need that many, but a lot of people like to go with a higher number. So if you were to choose a higher number, you'll notice that you have a whole lot more dots to choose from. This is usually when you want to kind of have a really small focusing point, and then you can kind of really refine it. The only problem is that now you have a whole bunch of dots to kind of go through in order to get to one side to the other. So Choose your poison on which one you want there, but I personally prefer the fewer dots so that I can move from one end of the screen to the other a little bit easier. But that's just, again, personal preference. Pre-AF focus, I go ahead and turn that off. AF illuminator, that's the little light up in front. If it doesn't have enough light, it flashes that light up in front trying to get focus. Generally speaking, I have that off because it can be really annoying, but if you're trying to take pictures in the dark and you're not getting focus, you definitely want to come back in here and turn that back on, because any pictures that's out of focus, it's not really going to help you. So maybe as a beginner, you want to keep that on just to help you get focus, because it is actually nice to have all of your pictures in focus. Face detect. So when you first start off, it's going to be off. If you take a lot of portraits, you probably want face detect on. If you're not going to be taking a whole lot of portraits, then you probably want it off. By default, I usually have it off until I find a need. Then I can come in here and turn it on and off. Just remember where it is in the menu settings if you have to turn that on and off quite a bit. AF to MF, I recommend just leaving that off. It's just a little bit easier. Manual focusing peaking. I recommend you come in here and you choose the red highlights. Those are usually the easiest to see, and I will show you what that looks like here in a second. So if you go all the way back up to focus modes and you select manual focus, it might actually be very hard to see because this is not a really high contrast scene, but you'll notice at the edge of this mannequin, there's actually a reddish outline right there. That's what focus peaking is. Unfortunately, I can't show it to you very well because this is just not a very good lighted scene for something like this, but there is an outline of a red highlight to show you that this is in focus. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it on high red because that's what's useful to me. But I definitely am going to go back to single focus because manual focus for these type of cameras, I don't really, it's not the type of camera that you choose for manual focus. Focus check, I would go ahead and keep that off. It's just not something that's very useful, at least for beginners anyways. Interlock, you definitely want that on. Not going to go into it, but you just definitely want that on. It basically tracks your light meter with your focus point, and that's very useful. Touch modes. This is something that is kind of useful to talk about. So the first one, or the default one to go with, is the AF one, and you've already seen this, in which when you touch, it goes to that focus point. Now, if you go back into the menu screen, you can also have it as shot, which is basically when you touch an area, and if it gets focus, it goes ahead and takes a picture. So this is something that could be very useful to you. It all depends on what you like. Another one is area, in which when you go ahead and touch, it just goes to that area. And this is the one that I probably like the most because it's the one that's least annoying to me, or I usually just shut it off. For me, I usually shut it off because I accidentally push the screen all of the time, and it just annoys me that my focus points keeps jumping around. Self timer, this is kind of self-explanatory, so you can choose a 2 or 10-second delay when you hit that shutter button. They also added in these new ones, which I have not tried yet, so feel free to go in there and try it. Interval shooting, so this allows you to do essentially pictures on a interval. So every certain amount of time that you specify, and it'll take a number of shots. So this is basically to put together time lapses. And what I really like about this camera is that it actually will put together a time lapse for you. So you can just select that. It'll take a whole bunch of pictures and then it'll combine them together for a time lapse. This one feature right here is probably what's going to make me keep this camera because it's so useful to have something like that. And you can select all the way up to 4K 30 frames per second, which is great. Bracketing isn't something that I'm going to cover in this menu because it's its own subject, but bracketing allows you to take multiple pictures to bracket what you're trying to compose, and it's something that's just really not something I want to cover right away. Photometry, definitely have it in multi. That's the most useful in the most general setting that you have. You don't really want to switch away from that. Shutter type. Shutter type is super important, and by default, it's only the mechanical shutter, What I would recommend here is that you actually go to mechanical and electronic shutter. Because the mechanical shutter will only go up to 1/4000th of a second, it would stop there and everything else is overexposed if you need a faster shutter speed. But if you select this setting, it will go to electronic shutter for anything above 1/4000th of a second. This basically just allows you a little bit more flexibility, but you do have to be careful when you do choose electronic shutter. It might shut off other functionality, so just be well aware of that. But in general, I do like mechanical plus electronic shutter. IS modes, I would definitely go ahead and leave it by default of 1, but you can go ahead and read through these if you want to tinker around with how your image stabilization works, but the default is perfectly fine with me. ISO auto modes, now this one is super important. So by default, you're in ISO auto 3, which is fine, but I would definitely come in here and look at these settings because I don't really like the default. So the minimum default is 200, which is the lowest that you can do, which is perfectly fine. For the max sensitivity, I would actually recommend you go all the way up to the top at 6400. A lot of people don't like to go above 3200 because above 3200 you start getting image noise. But here's the deal, you would rather have an image with image noise and have a sharp image than to have something that's capped at 3200, in which case you're going to have a low shutter speed and it's going to be a blurry image. Nowadays there are plenty of tools out there to kind of help reduce image noise in an image, but there's really nothing out there that's going to help you with a blurry image. So I always recommend for beginners to go ahead and set it to the max, because even if you get a noisy image, there are tools out there that can help you with image noise. There isn't any tools out there that can help you with a blurry image, which is what's going to happen if you hit the cap and the camera is still trying to take a picture. Minimum shutter speed. This is the one that's really kind of weird because the Fujifilm cameras don't really do a good job with minimum shutter speeds. Generally speaking, when it gets really dark, the shutter speeds get entirely way too low, and that's when you get blurry images. That's the reason why we raise the ISO. And what we're going to do here is we're probably going to cap the minimum shutter either at 1/30th of a second or 1/60th of a second. Now 1/30th of a second is a good choice if you're using lenses that have image stabilization built into the lens. If you are using primes and they don't have any type of image stabilizations, you really want to move up to 1/60th of a second because it's really going to help you capture sharper images. Once these numbers get a little bit too low for lenses that don't have image stabilization, you're just going to start getting blurry images, and that's not what you want. So definitely select either 1/30th of a second or 1/60th of a second. Those are my recommendations to you, but I'll go ahead and set this at 1/30th of a second. Adapters, you don't have to worry about that if you're using Fuji lenses, so I'm going to leave that alone. Zoom to touch, going to leave that alone. Wireless communications, we really haven't talked about connecting to the smartphone, and that's outside of this video, so I'm not going to touch upon that. Flash modes. Here's what I would recommend on flash modes. So by default, it's suppressed off, so it's always going to be off. I would go ahead and set it to either auto or force flash. One of the things that's very useful, of course, is that if it gets too dark, you kind of want to be able to use your flash, but you also don't want to get it into the way. So if you're the type of person that doesn't want to have a flash, then go ahead and just keep it at suppress flash. But it also might be a good idea to set it to auto in case you actually need it. That's my general recommendations to you on that. The movie menus, I'm just going to quickly go through this. This is going to be its own entire video because video is just a different part of the capabilities of this camera. And honestly, it's really not that great of a movie camera. It'll definitely get you by, but there are better options within the Fujifilm systems if you really want to take video seriously. But in here, you can select the different resolutions that you want to record at. You can also do slow motion, which is going to allow you to go all the way up to 60 frames per second, which really isn't all that great for slow motion, to be honest with you. Most people will want it in continuous autofocus. Digital image stabilization, it works okay with this camera. You definitely want to try it with it on and off, but definitely try it and see what you like. Auto ISO, I definitely recommend having this on. If you do go into fixed ISO and if you actually need something like this, honestly, this is not the camera system for you. You definitely want to step up to either an X-T200 or an X-T30 for stuff like that. HDMI out, if you're going to have an external monitor, you're going to want to turn that on, but in general, I have that off. output to an SD card, and then these are the mic levels, which honestly on this camera the mic levels aren't very good, and you're probably going to have to lower them down to 1, and you're still going to get a lot of background hiss, unfortunately. But honestly, the video menu is going to be its own separate video, so I just ran very quickly through it. Alrighty, we got into the wrench icon, and I kind of covered this in my get started quickly video, which is the first video in this series. So I'm just going to quickly run through this. In the user settings, there are two things that are important. You can format your SD card, and you can also come all the way down here and you can reset all of your menus, your entire camera. So if you ever get lost and you don't know why your camera is doing something, you can come down here and just reset your entire camera. A lot of times, a lot of people will message me or email me saying, I don't know why this is happening. And my first bit of advice is always to reset your camera to see if it solves the problem, because there are so many things that you can change in here. I honestly don't know what you've done in order to make something work or not work. So resetting your camera is definitely very useful. Your sounds, you can turn them on and off. In general, I like to turn all of my sounds off, but personal preference here. When it comes to screen setup, there are a couple of really interesting things that you can do. Number one, your frame guides. You can either go with a 9 or you can go with the more grids. This is definitely useful for video purposes, but this is more useful for photography. So choose one or the other depending on what you like. Your focus distance metrics, you can either choose meter or feet. So depending on whether or not if you're in America or not, you might want to opt to go to feet instead of meters. And then your custom display settings. We went through this in our first video, so you can definitely turn on things on and off for your display, and it's very useful. So we're going to go into the buttons. We went into a little bit into the buttons, but really the most useful one in here is that you can actually change your function buttons. And there's really only one, and I don't recommend changing it off the record button because it is the most useful thing to do. And then we move into power management. So power management, auto shut off at 2 minutes. I recommend keeping it there. And then the performance mode, if you feel like your camera is a little bit sluggish, you can definitely turn it on to high performance mode, but that does affect your battery life. So that's something that you're going to have to be well aware of. So it's your choice on whether or not you want to turn that on and off. We go into the saving of your files, which I would leave at default. I wouldn't change anything. And connection settings, which is connecting to your smartphones. Again, that's for a different video. And that is all of the menu settings right there. So I went through them super quickly. Hopefully that helped you out. If you have any questions, definitely leave it in the comments below. I'll do my best to help you out, but hopefully that helped you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.